Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and welcome back to our Metroidvania in Unity tutorial series, where right now we're working on a mini-series creating enemy AI. In our last video, we added a couple of new states so that our enemy now patrols back and forth. He stands guard if the player gets close but is out of reach, and he'll chase when we get really close. That said, he also stops when he gets to our player, which is actually not what we want ultimately. Instead, we want him to actually attack here. So that's where we're headed in this video. We'll add an attack state and also set up the logic for combat and taking damage. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. So first things first, let's make it so that we can actually see an attack here on the screen. If we head to our animator, you can see that we've already created an attack animation, and we have a transition that goes into it whenever this is attacking bool gets set to true. Let's come down to our project folder here where we can right click, create a new mono behavior script, and we'll call this one melee attack state. Now for the moment, we're just going to create a very bare bones state here that really just triggers the attack. Let's begin by getting rid of start and update. Make sure that we are inheriting from the base state instead of from mono behavior, and then we'll create our constructor, which will just use the same name as this script, taking in a reference to our enemy script, and also passing that enemy reference along to the base state. Now the really important thing here is that up at the top, we create an override string for our anim bool name, which will just tell the state which animation it's going to set true when we enter and set false when we exit this state. The one last thing we'll do for now during our setup is just create our override enter method. And there's just two things to do here. First, we want to tell our base state that it should run its enter logic. That's what will play our animation. And then we also want to make sure that we set our linear velocity to 0 so that we don't keep moving if we were moving when we entered the state. Lastly, I just made a little typo here. Our base state should be taking in an enemy reference. Now that we've got a rough state set up, we need to actually have a way to transfer into it, which means we need to detect when we're in attack range. So let's head to our enemy config and make a new header here for attack settings. Here we'll just make a public float that will dictate our melee attack range, and I'll set mine to about 1.2 for now. Now that we have that value, we can go into our enemy senses and actually create the logic to detect whether or not an enemy target is in range. For this, we'll just use a public bool method, similar to what we did for our cliff and wall check, called is in melee range. The difference this time though is that we're actually going to take in a transform reference to the target. So first off, if for some reason something went wrong and a target did not get passed in properly or we lost it, we want to just return false, as obviously we are no longer in range. Next though, we want to actually calculate the distance between us and our target. For this, we're going to use a Unity helper method called vector2.distance. For this, we just pass in the two things we want to check the distance between. In our case, our target's position and our position. Next, we're just going to return the result of the question. We're going to say, is our distance less than or equal to our range? Now, before we leave here, let's just head down to our onDraw gizmos and actually visualize this. So we'll do a melee check here, and this time I'll set my gizmo's color to magenta. Next, we're going to use a wire sphere for this one. And here we'll just have our circle originate at the attack point position, and we'll use our config's melee range to show how large that circle should be. Now at this point back in Unity, you should be able to click on your enemy and see the magenta circle that represents his attack range. Now we're almost ready to test. However, while we can detect whether a target is in range, we don't currently have any way to transition into our attack state. So let's head to our chase state to set up our first transition. So in chase state, our highest priority will still be getting our target and making sure we face it. However, if we make it past that point, we want to check if we're close enough to attack. Here we'll just check if our senses is in melee range returns true. If it does, that means that we're ready to change state to our melee attack state. Next, I'll just put return so that we don't try to execute any more of the logic in here as we make our transition to the new state. After that, we'll just continue through this state as before, though I'm just going to update the numbers in my notes here. Now, chase state isn't the only state that will transition into melee attack. However, we are going to be adding a little more logic before we're done, so we'll get this one working perfectly before we copy paste its logic into those other states. All right, let's test this thing out. Now, when we run the game, as soon as we get close to the enemy, he does indeed start attacking, so that's working as expected. Obviously, we want to stop him from chaining attacks, we want him to leave the state, and we also want him to be able to deal damage. Let's actually start with that damage dealing. If you've been following along in this series, we created a health script back when we did our player attack state, and we put it on our attack dummy. We're actually going to use that exact same script for our player as well, so let's take a look at that. Now, just as a quick refresher, our health script is generally pretty standard. The one thing that's a little different from some other systems is that we have these two actions for on damaged and on death. Currently, those aren't wired up to do anything for our player. Don't worry, we'll do that in the next video. But the main thing I want to focus on here is this change health method. It just takes in an integer for the amount of health to change, so it can heal or damage. It then changes our health by that amount, caps our health at max health so we don't overheal, and then if our health gets below 0, it sends out a message that we've died, which in the next video we'll hook up. And if the amount is negative or less than 0, that means we're taking damage and we need to call that on damaged event, which later on will handle things like knockback and playing a damaged animation. Now, first off, back in Unity, let's add this health script onto our player and then make sure to set some values. I'll give him a max health of 10 as well as a current health of 10. Next, similar to what we've done for our enemy senses, we're going to create a new component to handle our combat. So let's call this enemy_combat. Now, our EnemyCombat script is actually going to be what handles all of the logic to do with attacking and dealing damage. Our state will play the animation and say, hey, we're attacking now, but combat's going to be what actually runs that logic. Now, keep in mind, our enemy sense is already checked if a target was in range, but here we're going to do a second check that will come afterwards when the blow actually lands. This will provide a nice little window in between where the player can dodge or block or something like that. So let's begin with a public void method here called perform melee attack, and we'll go ahead and do that check to see if there's anything to deal damage to. So we'll do a collider 2D here called hit, and we're just going to fill that variable with the result of an overlap circle check. Now this circle is going to originate at our attack point position, which does mean we'll need to make a reference to it. This will be the same attack point our senses uses, we just need to have a separate reference here so that this script isn't reliant on senses but can run on its own. Next, we'll make sure that the radius of our circle is equal to our config's melee range, which means that yet again, we're going to need to make a reference to our config. So we'll create a private enemy config reference called config, and actually we're just going to have the code find this on its own as soon as the game starts. Now we'll do this in our start method. However, we already have a reference to config in our game and it's sitting on our enemy. So let's come up top here and also make a reference to the enemy script. Now when the game begins, we'll first of all find the enemy. We'll just say get component enemy as it's on the same game object as combat. And then once we've got a reference to enemy, we can just find the config by saying enemy config is equal to enemy.config. And that'll just grab the config reference right out of our enemy script. All right. Last thing we need for our overlap circle is just to know what our target layer is, and we'll grab this also from our config. So now that we've cast the circle, we'll know whether or not the player got out of the way since we started this attack. So if, in fact, there's no hit, we didn't find a player in here, then we just want to return and not execute any further. That said, if we did hit something that's in our target layer, we first of all just want to grab a reference to its health script. So we'll do this by looking on the hit object and just getting component health. Now, if we actually found that health component, so it's not null, then we just want to tell it that it needs to change health by a negative version of our config's melee damage. Negative because it's damage and we don't want to go healing the thing that we're attacking. Now we'll need to add that damage value to our config, but first let's just make sure that this config check here uses a capital since that's what our enemy does, and we'll get an error if we don't fix that. All right, and then in config, let's just come down to the bottom where we can make a public integer for our melee damage. And I'm just gonna start mine off at 2, though we can change that in the inspector later. Back in Unity, let's click on our enemy and make sure to add the EnemyCombat script. Also just gonna move my animator up top so that the components I've made are all together. All right, let's make sure it knows where the attack point is so we can grab that from our hierarchy. Next, we just need to call that perform melee attack method. We're actually going to do this from our animation. That way we can time it up perfectly so that when he actually fully extends his swing is when we deal the damage. So in our attack animation here, I'm just going to add an animation event. And then over on the right here, we can pick from all of the scripts that are on our player and call any public methods. So let's set that up right now. Okay, now when we get in the game, if I click on my player, you can see that when I'm within range, every time he swings at us, we are in fact losing 2 health. We'll set up death in the next video. That said, I think our next thing is going to be to get our kobold actually exiting the state. Let's get rid of that repeat first of all by going into our animator. We can click on our animation here, which will highlight it down in our project folder. I'll just click that and turn off loop time. That will stop him from repeatedly attacking. However, we're still stuck in our attack state and we're going to need to be able to exit and then re-enter to attack again. So in our melee attack state, Let's create a new method here, another override one, and we'll call this onAnimationFinished, as it's going to be called from our animation as soon as it's finished. Now once we have finished attacking, we simply just want to tell our enemy to go back to his idle state, and then idle state will take things from there. So now then we just have to make sure that this onAnimationFinished is actually being called from our animation. Now since our animation can't directly call a method in a non-mono behavior, we're gonna funnel this through our state system the same way we do with our update and fixed update. So first we'll go to our state and just create a general virtual onAnimationFinished method. Then we'll go back to our enemy, the actual mono behavior, and down by update and fixed update, we'll create that public void onAnimationFinished. This is what the animation itself will call when it's done. And as soon as it does, it'll just pass that message along to the state machine, letting whatever state we're currently in know that we can in fact run our onAnimationFinished logic. Back in Unity then we'll click on our enemy and go to our attack animation. Let's just go to the very end where we can create an animation event, make sure that it knows it needs to call our enemy's onAnimationFinished method as soon as it's done. Now when we get in the game, we'll see that our enemy runs close and attacks. He is still kind of attacking very quickly. That said, when we move away, he knows that he needs to leave the state. And so things are actually working perfectly. The only thing is our enemy has no cooldown. So let's begin with the data. We'll go into our enemy config and create a float for our melee cooldown. And the beautiful thing about doing this is that we can give every enemy we create a different length of cooldown. Now, if we come into our EnemyCombat script, we can apply that cooldown. So the way we're going to do this is we're always going to track the time whenever we make an attack. So let's make a private float here called last attack time. And then anytime we perform a melee attack, we just want to make sure that that last attack time gets filled with whatever the current time is. Now that we know when the last attack happened, we can calculate when we're ready to attack again. So let's create a new public bool method called canMeleeAttack. And here we'll just return the value of a simple question. Is the time.time or current time greater than our last attack time plus our cooldown's length? So if our last attack time was at 3 seconds and our cooldown is 1, we won't be able to attack again until the current time is at least 4 seconds into the game. Now then, let's go into our chase state, and whatever we want to attack, we won't just check if we're in range, we're also going to ask the combat script if we can melee attack, which means are we ready to do it again. Now, as with all of our other things, we're going to have to make sure that this is set up in our base states. So let's make a protected EnemyCombat reference, come down to the constructor and make sure that it fills combat by looking at enemy and getting its combat reference. And then finally, we have to actually go to enemy and make sure that it is storing a reference to combat. Again, the nice thing is that when we add our ranged attack later on, we won't have to do any of this as it will already be set up. Now, just before we leave here, let's make sure that in awake, we actually find that combat script. So combat is equal to, and we'll just use a get component call since the combat script is on the same object as our enemy. Now we could do a test right now and we'd see that he attacks once and then just gets hung up in the idle state. And that's because we've only written our transition out of chase state. So let's go into the chase state and grab our logic from there that checks if we're ready to attack, and just make sure that we also put this into our idle state. Once again, we'll do this as step 2, and I'm just going to update all of my notes so that they follow in order now that we've added another step. With that done, we can go in the game and things are working as before. However, now when he gets close, he attacks once, waits for that 1 second cooldown, and then attacks again. He also repositions himself if I move a little so that he's in the correct range, and you'll see my player is in fact losing health. All right, things are working really well, except that, of course, this is kind of lame combat. And so I could just play with a few things here. I could play with my turn threshold if I want the enemy not to get quite so close before he attacks. And in our next video, we'll add things like damaged animations, perhaps some particles, and also the ability to die. That's where we're headed next. I hope to see you in that video. Until then though, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.